A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. On leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. They immediately told him about her. He approached, grasped her hand, and helped her up. And then the fever left her, and she waited on them. When it was evening, after sunset, they brought to him all who were ill or possessed by demons. The whole town was gathered at the door. He cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he drove out many demons, not permitting them to speak because they knew him. Rising very early before dawn, he left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. Simon and those who were with him pursued him, and on finding him said, "Everyone is looking for you." He told them, "Let us go on to the nearby villages, that I may preach there also. For this purpose I have come." So he went into their synagogues, preaching and driving out demons throughout the whole of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord.
Today, instead of a normal homily, I'd like to give you more of a little Bible study on the book of Job. The book of Job from which we heard the first reading, which really was connected with the second reading by the theme of suffering, but I'm going to steer away from that and just talk about the book of Job in general, because it's one of the most well-known books of the Old Testament after Genesis and Exodus, and it fits into a category of literature that we call wisdom literature. But even apart from its biblical status, it's recognized by critics as a masterpiece of literature. And the reason it's a masterpiece is, well, there are a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons is that it deals with a very difficult theme, a very difficult question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Or, why do good things happen to bad people? So let's look at a little bit at the wisdom literature in general. In the Old Testament, there are, if I remember right, 5 so-called wisdom books. They include the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, and Job. There might be another one or two that I'm forgetting. But in any case, the wisdom in this sense is to be thought of as a combination of reason and faith. And the purpose of the wisdom books, their goal is to teach us how to live well, how to live a godly life. So the book of Job is not an account of something. It's not like the Gospels that tell a story of something that actually happened. It's rather a made-up story. It's fictitious, or it's a fiction. And it starts out with the first chapter with the description of Job. Job was a wealthy and prosperous man, but he was also an upright and just man. He followed the laws of God. And we are told that he had many, many animals, thousands of animals, a sign of wealth at the time. This is probably about 600 BC, when the book was written, the story was written. And he had a big house, we're told, and he had 10 children, a sign of blessing from God. And so, as the story goes, Satan was patrolling around the world, checking things out. And he goes to report back to God. This is a fictitious, of course, but you'll see the whole purpose of the story in a moment. Satan reports to God that he has seen his servant Job. God asks Satan, "Have you seen my servant Job? Isn't he quite the fellow?" And Satan says, "You know what? I'm going to bet you that if you took away all his animals, tore his house down, and killed his children, that he wouldn't bless you anymore. He would curse you. He wouldn't follow your laws." So God says, "Okay, let's have a test. Let's see what happens." So God says, you can test him, you can take away all of his stuff, but don't hurt him. So So God allows all of Job's stuff to be taken away. His animals get stolen, his house gets knocked down by a storm, and his 10 children die. And Job sits down in a pile of ashes, a sign of penitence, and he says these famous words, "Naked I came forth from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Now these famous words are followed by a description of the narrator. The narrator says, through all of his difficulties, Job never cursed God and he never sinned. Now we have to step out of the story for a moment and remember that for the Jews, they thought that if you were sick, if you had leprosy or you were blind or whatever, that either you had sinned or your parents had sinned. And if you were poor and had no money, it must be because you're a sinner, not because just that's the way things are sometimes. So they connected prosperity with holiness, if you will. Now this same notion comes up today. You can turn on the TV, some of those TV preachers, televangelists they're called, and they'll be talking about if you follow God's law and you send me money, then, and you're a good person, whatever that means, then God will bless you with riches. Don't listen. The book of Job is all about dispelling this myth. Why do bad things happen to good people like Job? So back to our story. Job's wife comes to him and says, "What's your sin? You've got to confess your sin and so we can get our house back and our kids back or whatever. Get back on track." Job says, "I didn't do anything. What can I say?" So his wife doesn't believe him, of course. And so 3 of his friends come to visit, and they start talking to him and saying, "Job, you need to stop sinning. You need to confess your sin and get back on track." He says, "I haven't done anything." They say, "You must have done something because all this bad stuff happened to you." So Satan goes back to God and says, "Okay, well, you won that round." Satan says, "If I take away his health, if you take away his health, then he'll curse you in sin and deny you and not follow your laws anymore." So God says to Satan, "Okay, you can let him get sick, I'll let him get sick, but don't kill him, don't harm him, don't take away his life." So Job he gets these boils all over him, he gets really sick, and his friends say, "Now look, what are you doing? You gotta stop." He says, "I'm not doing anything." Now, that's the first chapter. The next 38 chapters are extremely long and extremely boring. And I think they're written that way on purpose. The author intended to show us the foolishness of trying to understand God's ways, as we'll see in a moment. So the next 37 chapters, or 38 chapters, are all the discourses and conversations of Job's friends and Job and his wife. And they talk, and they talk, and they talk, and they talk, and they get nowhere. They say nothing. And I think the author wrote it this way on purpose, to show how bored God must be with us sometimes when we try to figure out, what are you doing this to me for, God? So the last couple of chapters, well, at the end of the discourses, the conversation, God has had enough of this noise. He breaks in and says, "Stop, enough." I forgot to bring my Bible, I was going to read to you. I'll tell you briefly what he says. He says to Job, "Oh, so you know everything, do you? So where were you when the universe was created, and I hung the stars in the heavens and created the moon and the sun? Where were you?" And he goes on, "Where were you when I created all the plants and the animals and caused the earth to be green and to fruitful and multiply? Where were you? Tell me if you know." He says, "Gird up your loins like a man. Tell me if you know." And he goes on like this, God does, for about 2 chapters, just smushing Job down to the ground. Boom, boom, boom. And finally, Job responds. He says, "I have spoken once. I made a mistake. I will cover my mouth. I will not speak again, because you are God, and I am nothing." At the end of the story, Job gets all of his stuff back, twice as much. He gets 20 children instead of 10. They don't come back to life, obviously. He gets 20 new children. He gets new animals. He gets a twice as big house, etc. Now, the whole point of this story is to demonstrate that, first of all, Job didn't do anything. He didn't sin. He didn't curse God. And so there was no reason, as far as we can tell, for bad stuff to happen to him. And yet it did. The point is that Job stayed faithful through. He was faithful when he was at the beginning, when he was rich. Oh, I forgot to tell you that every day he prayed to God and offered sacrifices for his children, because he was a God-fearing man. He was rich, he happened to be rich, but in it, he was faithful to God. When he was devastated and was poor and covered with disease and had lost all of his stuff, he was faithful to God. When all of his friends were telling him, you must be sinning, you must be doing something wrong, blah, 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 he stayed faithful to God. And at the end, when he got rich again, it looks as though God made him rich because he was faithful. That's not the story. He got rich again just because God wanted to make him rich again. He stayed faithful no matter what. That's the point. So the point, if you want to take away, is the answer to the question, the mystery, if you will. Why do bad things happen to good people? And why does all that good stuff happen to those bad people? Because God is God, and God does what God will do. That's it. And if we can't understand it, that's not his problem, it's our problem. Maybe he doesn't want us to understand it. God will do what God will do, and that's the end of the story. We could, like Job, spend 38 chapters, Job and his friends, blah, blah, blahing about woe is me and why does God do this. It's all a waste of time. The point of the story is, God will do what God will do. Our task is to stay faithful. It doesn't matter what happens, we stay faithful.